We drinking coffee tonight?
We are definitely drinking coffee tonight. It's been a long couple days.
Nope. I'm just gonna put my foot on the floor and I'm not lifting till I see God or a checkered flag.
Josh Berry wins in Vegas for first Cup win. Small team. Josh Berry, small-ish team.
Penske backing, but yeah, smallish. I'm always happy to see the Wood Brothers car win. The Wood Brothers car, the Petty 43 wins. That's always significant to me for sure. Always cool for sure.
Yeah, shout out to Josh Berry, and he looked happy. First win in Vegas. I mean, come on, the guy was having a good.
That's cool. I think everybody probably from that Stuart Haas deal, and even Ryan Priest, my good friend and friend to run third. Probably. I think, Chase Briscoe got that win at Darlington, but other than that, that was probably a pretty tough year for them guys last year, kind of going through everything that was going on over there. So to see them come out in a situation that's, maybe Noah Gregson, I'm not sure about his situation, but I mean, certainly the other three guys came out in probably better deals than they had at least last year for sure. So that's exciting. And, Josh Berry comes from the short tracks and, that's what we all aspire to do with our careers. And he's one of those guys that, won the races and got noticed, and it's hard to do these days. So never met the guy, but it's definitely a cool start. And those are the guys you definitely want to root for.
I feel like he's a guy you guys will get along really well.
Yeah, you gotta. I mean, you gotta respect that. And definitely cool to see, and definitely stands out. And getting there, not at 20 years old. That's another thing that kind of resonates with me because I'm kind of I got to the game a little bit later than I probably needed to go be a Kyle Busch or whatever. And I still could, you never know, but he's getting to the game a little bit later. I even like I remember back when I was younger, David Gilliland was one of the guys I always pulled for just because of that, just because he kept digging and digging and digging, and he got his shot and he won the Xfinity race, and he had a chance to be a Cup driver there, and did it later in his career. So I always thought that was kind of cool. So definitely pull for them guys, and that was cool to see. Hopefully Ryan gets one this year too. That obviously he's the one I probably pull for the most in that deal. I probably just fan wise, I'm probably a Denny Hamlin guy, but just overall, just drivers and kind of knowing the situations, and I'm always rooting for Ryan Priest. If he's up there for sure, he's always the one I'll pull for.
Do you fill out a bracket yet?
No, I usually don't get too into it, but I usually if I get my eyeballs on it, I'm pulling for Duke. I always like Duke, so I did see that they're the favorites. They had a really good record and they're 1 seed in their bracket, so we'll see. There's a lot of excitement, but I'm always following. There's always the parody's been really good the past few years, so it's been a lot more interesting. Usually you kind of write off, the early rounds other than the middle matchups. But, once you get up into the 1, 2, 3 seeds, it's almost like a lock. And now it's not a lock, so.
We have to bring this up. And even though we're not a basketball show, you are in New York. And I'm just going to say, I never in my life would have thought St. John's would ever come back and be competitive, because Big East schools, there's a drop off on a lot of those old school Big East schools and then all of a sudden Patino and St. John, I was like, do we take a time machine back to the 80s that New York City basketball for college is back?
It's funny because, just sports in general, I'm being from Buffalo, we're 8 hours from New York City. So we really don't have a strong connection with New York, obviously, with the Big East stuff. We were a lot closer to Syracuse and so we were kind of paying attention to it that way for sure. But, and the Big East was such a cool conference, and it's such a shame the way, football kind of broke all that up, because the rivalries that existed in the Big East, I mean, it was different back then because, kids played 4 years and, the rivalries built, and now it's, you're basically just showcasing for the NBA, and it's just not the same. That's probably why I don't watch it. a ton, even though when it was good, it was probably before, I was born really, but, just kind of being somebody that always loves those old 30 for 30s and stuff and then learning about stuff that way,
Oh, the
all
the
the,
Big East 30 for 30 with like you got John
oh
Thompson,
yeah.
a
Oh my
young
God. That was so good.
time.
Requiem for the Big East.
It's so good.
That it was so good. It was like a 2 a.m. watch. It was like I was gonna fall asleep, right? And I turned this on and I was just like glued to it. Like I'm all tired at work the next day, kind of like I am today. But yeah, it was just so good. Um,
And Jim Boeheim looked like 16 years old in that,
yeah,
and he
yeah,
just
yeah.
retired like a couple of years ago.
Oh, I know it. I know it. Yeah, no, it's a shame, really. Just all of it. It's just it ain't what it used to be. It never will be. And it's probably true of a lot of things, I guess. But
I
a
was
lot
trying
of
to
those.
find
But
some
even beyond the Big East, I mean, you had Michael Jordan, and
Yep.
you had, the cool. The 1983 Wolfpack is the coolest sports story that Alan Kowicki's right there, but I mean that Wolfpack story is just unbelievable. With everything that went on that year and them being the underdogs that they were, and just people just don't understand today what an accomplishment that was, what an achievement that was for what those guys did and what that meant to people. And I don't know, I don't know, stuff like that's just one in a million.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with the Doctors of Dunk, Phi Slamma Jamma in Houston, and I've tried to explain to young guys, I'm like, you don't understand. There was a stretch in college basketball where like Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler played on the same team for like 4 years.
Well,
Like none of this happened. There was a group of schools that were all within like 8-hour driving distance from each other on the East Coast that were all unbelievable. And
yeah.
now
And they all had their own 30 for 30, and every one of them was just one you could sit down and watch again after a month.
it was
The Phi Slamma Jamma one was so good. All of them, just every side of it, just good stuff. It was one of them deals, like looking back at like 90s NASCAR, like just watching how great it was. And like you're sitting there watching it at the time and you just had no idea.
you don't know the good old days.
No,
when
you
you're
don't know. Because I was a fan of NASCAR in the 90s, and I was always thinking like, man, it was so much cooler in the 80s with like Kelly Yarborough, this, you know, but now you look back on it and you think Mark Martin and Ricky Rudd and all these guys, there were Rusty Wallace and Dale Earnhardt, and then Jeff Gordon comes in and ruffles all the feathers, and I just never again. So,
And
um,
I text you and said somebody sent me this hat that has for sure it has Richard Petty on it.
that's cool.
And I don't know the rest of the signatures on it,
I'm
but
surprised Richard Petty would sign it because it's kind of a competing sponsor.
yeah, this must be old Richard Petty when he didn't really know what was going on.
So tell you what made my day. Is Mark Martin on there?
I don't know. There's a signature
he
2K.
he commented the ADJ Racing Facebook a couple times last week.
Hey, we need to get that.
I was like, oh my god, it's like you're Mark Martin. Like he's got to be like the coolest, most laid back. You just listen. He posts a lot on social media, and he's very, in tune with like kind of the old school philosophies and where they still exist in racing. And he's a big champion of that, and he's got to be a really cool dude. We listened to a Dinner with Racers podcast, which is a podcast series, really good podcast series. They mostly do road course stuff, and they're all pretty good episodes. But I stopped and I listened to the Mark Martin one, and it was like moving, really, just to hear his story, the way he told it. It's probably just the way he told it. I think, maybe on that day, he was kind of an open book. And, I've heard a lot of interviews, a lot of different, stuff like that. And I've never heard an interview like that I was just so locked in. And it was like 3 hours long. And I wish it was 4. It was so interesting just kind of listening to him talk about, everything that was going on behind the scenes with racing and how he's processed racing, how he wanted to win the championship so bad. And that's the only thing in life that mattered. And that's like, yeah, that's me, that's me right now. All that matters is winning. And how with time to reflect and look back on things, maybe, maybe, you know, things weren't exactly the way that he thought they were back then. And, you know, he wished that he had took more time to enjoy it a little bit and celebrate it a little bit and be in the moment probably a little bit more. And I think he, you know, I don't know, it was just very interesting to hear his perspective on all of it. And, it was really cool. It was very emotional. You know, he talks about it's his dad, and he went through a spell of drinking, and you know, everything that he went through as his career was going on. Things you don't know about. You know, you turn the TV on Sunday and you watch the race, right? And you know, when he first got into NASCAR, he wanted to build his own car, and he turned down the 28 car that ended up going to Kelly Yarborough and winning a ton of races. And he's like, no, I could build my own car better than that. And, you know, he built a car, and it was, you know, he built a light car, but it couldn't last, and all these trials and errors, and how he had to go back to ASA and start all over again, and how he got a second opportunity with Roush. And it was just so cool to hear what was going on behind the scenes and all the struggles, and just, you know, even like the old ASA days are just, that had to be like those 80s ASA drivers. That had to be the coolest. Yeah, I'm a modified guy, so I mean, whatever, modifieds in the 80s, they're still probably the coolest, but like that 80s ASA group, you know, like Dick Trickle, Rusty Wallace, you know, Mark Martin, Jankowiak, all these guys. I mean, that had to be awesome. You know, that was just badass racing, and hearing all the stories from those guys, you know, which is a collection of them on that Dinner with Racers podcast. They did Rusty, and they did a long thing on Jankowiak, but the Mark Martin one was by far and away the best.
I think 80s and 90s sports, I think, have this weird nostalgia because we didn't have access like we have now. Like now, you know, everything about everyone in especially NASCAR, like, you know, everything about everyone. So there's not like the mystique. Like there's no such thing now as like these legendary stories. Like those legendary stories are told on social media. So you don't, I can tell people all the time, that's what Michael Jordan has over LeBron. It's this weird mystique where there was a lot of these like legendary stories that you had trouble corroborating them. You weren't sure if they were true. Like, you know, documentaries that have come out after Dale Earnhardt died, where like guys are corroborating these stories that you're like, so these were real things. Like we were living through this. Like you're telling me that like Earnhardt pulls Gordon aside in a hallway and is like, listen, we both want to sell a crap ton of merch. Let's kind of manufacture this thing and lean into it a little bit. Like that would have been come out on social media nowadays. It would have come out like, oh, so-and-so heard from so-and-so. And like the rest of us, we just kind of, I think the blissful ignorance of that kind of builds in this mystique that now is a little bit tougher to get. Like you almost have almost too much access to them. And I agree. I lived through the 80s and 90s and didn't think that. I was like, this is how it always will be. That's how it always will be. It'll never be any different than this. And now I look at it and I'm like, boy, I'd appreciated it a lot more if I'd have known what I was living through.
I know it. Yeah, hard to picture Dale Earnhardt sitting here doing a podcast.
And what, like Kill Yarbrough doing the junior podcast, you're like, this is so weird. You guys, none of you, those old drivers, gave off any sort of indication that they would have been like doing that level of transparency on media. They did not give off that would have been something they would have done.
Right. No, I agree with that for sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, the moral of the story is enjoy it whatever era you're living in for NASCAR, enjoy it now, because in 20 years it will look completely different and you'll have lived through the good old days and didn't know you had them.
I don't know. I think the 90s was it. I don't know.
Listen, man. That goes into my first topic, because there is this thing online that says the 90s is the last era of real pop culture because everything else moves too fast now. And so the rumors, and this is hilarious, there are more rumors circulating of Chevy truck bringing back the square body. Now, if that doesn't show the 90s nostalgia, that's the last era of like pop culture nostalgia. Square body trucks making a comeback just based on the fact that the used truck market for square body Chevys is so high that Chevy's like, maybe we should take out and bring back square bodies and like an old school interior look and all that. And I'd be for it. I think it'd be cool.
I'd be for it too, but unfortunately, it kind of feels a little gimmicky. I don't know. I
You're
mean,
old.
in
You're
my
old.
mind, all right, in my mind, like we should go back to NASCAR cars that don't coil bind, that they're steel body. I'm serious. Like I'm dead serious about this, and I mean this in my heart. I don't know if it would actually work or not because I think you got to evolve, right? But like if you if you just watch a NASCAR like a cup car go in a circle today versus watching a NASCAR cup car drive in a circle in 1997, it is like astronomically more exciting to watch that cup car in 1997 because it had a suspension and they're just, the exhaust is poking out at the wall. They're loud as hell. And they're bouncing through the racetrack now they're like locked in and it's downforce and they're playing these little aero games and it's terrible to watch really sometimes, not all the time. I mean, there's a lot of good racing out there today and I get the drivers all the credit in the world, but the racing might be better now than it was back then, but the physical like action of the car though, before the coil binding era kind of took over, to me it was more exciting to watch. Like you just watch like a car drive around Atlanta and Rockingham going through them bumps, like you could see the guy, like Dale Jarrett, like he's sawing on that wheel. It doesn't look the same anymore, and I think that's something that's probably missing, and probably even late models. You watch like a late model race now at a short track, and they're so locked into the racetrack. They go to the primary groove, and there's no racing anymore. They drive to the bumper, and they hit you, and they wiggle you, and they pass you. It's it was just such a different form of racing, and I think a lot of that has to do with the suspensions and the coil bind. And I think it was better back then in that regard for sure. I think the racers today are, they have more reliable cars and they're trained to be more aggressive. And I think in a lot of ways, the physical racing and the competition is probably tougher. And it's interesting and it's fun to watch these guys be aggressive. But, the action of the car, I think in versus 25 years ago is a lot more exciting just physically watching it.
And what's funny is probably guys in Petty's era were looking at the 90s like, look at these guys, all this technology. Here we are. We had to drive cars that were roadworthy and had tail lights.
Right. And that's what, when we talk about going back to a square body truck, like let's go back to the Lumina. That was great.
I,
Let's go back to the Oldsmobile Cutlass car. I missed that one. I don't know. Yes, I agree. But I feel like if you did that every time, some of those old memories would lose some of their special place, and you kind of things get watered down a little bit, and you see it all the time with, they come back with the Camaro and they did those Chargers that, they kind of look like the old Chargers and they're cool and a couple people bought them. They get stuck in the snow up here and then no one likes them. But, I don't know. I feel like there's probably a boardroom with like 50 people that, are paid to come up with an idea every day. And this was just someone's idea that day. It'll probably sell a couple cars. But I think in the long run, unfortunately, as much as we feel that attachment to the past and that nostalgia, I think probably, life goes on.
I can remember when the Charger came out. My dad's 63. So, this is his era. And that ain't a Charger. Like, what are you talking about? It's got 4 doors on it. That ain't a Charger. I was like, okay, I get what you're saying, Dad. And I thought he was like being an old man on a park bench. And then when Ford put out that Mustang SUV, I was the guy that was like, what are we doing? What are we doing? That ain't a Mustang. What are we doing?
Yeah.
Like, just some good things should just be left the way that they are. It's okay. We don't have to redo everything.
No, it's never going to be the same. It's not about the body style to me. I mean, to me, it's about, plopping an engine that you know how to work on into a car and tuning your carburetor and changing spark plug wires and going down the street. And it's getting harder and harder to do that for, an everyday mechanic. I mean, I work on race cars all the time. I could take a race car part, put it back together. I can get about halfway through an engine before I'll screw something up. But I always have older street cars. Like my newest car I've ever owned is probably like a 2005 because I always end up with older cars. So always had older cars, but every time I go up and a generation in car, they get harder and harder to work on. My grandma's car is 15 years old and I do maintenance on it. And it's, I got to open up my phone and figure out where everything is. And, I was like, when I was younger, I was all those old Honda Civics, and it was basically a pretty straightforward engine. I mean, it wasn't a Chevy 350, but you had, your valve cover, you had your everything, your distributor over here, and you just made it work. And your time belt's on this side, and it's connected to all the other stuff that spins, and you figure it out. Now, you got to take everything apart and reprogram the computer, and the key fob doesn't work then, so you got to open the door 3 times and blink twice, and you know like turn the key on and off, and I don't even know, say a magic word, and then the car's reprogrammed. It's I don't know, it's bizarre. So, but I think that when we talk about nostalgia, I think people probably remember having their own cars as their own projects, and it's not that way anymore.
No. Speaking of nostalgia, Andy J's NASCAR driver Mount Rushmore. You got to pick 4 drivers that you got to put on your Mount Rushmore.
I was supposed to think about this week, wasn't I?
Well, the good news is you've named a bunch of them, so there's,
Well, I mean, 2 are obvious. Unfortunately, it's hard to argue with the status quo. 2 are obvious because you have Richard Petty and you have Dale Earnhardt, and they dominate their eras. And for the newer era, it's hard for me because you don't want to put Jimmy Johnson and Jeff Gordon up there because you feel like they were kind of from the same era. And I feel like Jeff Gordon made a much larger impact on the sport than Jimmy Johnson. But Jimmy Johnson very efficiently and effectively through his team won 7 championships. So he's the third 7-time champion. So to me, I kind of lean towards Gordon just because of his influence and Gordon is the reason NASCAR is what it is today. It was the good old boy sport. And this guy came in and he was polished and sponsors liked him. And he had a decorative fire suit and everything was different about it. And he was this young kid, coming up from, dirt cars and look at what we have today now. Everyone is some model of Jeff Gordon, and everyone does an interview, it's something modeled after Jeff Gordon. He was very well spoken and he changed the sport. And I feel like, he probably didn't, his driving style probably didn't translate well into the chase series, the chase point format. I feel like if you look at the old system, now granted, it's hard to apply the old system points to seasons because obviously you're racing through chases and you're doing different things. But if just for shits and giggles, if you apply the old point system to every year, Jeff Gordon's a 7-time champion.
Right.
And not that matters because it's the chase and that's just the way it is. But I think I put Jeff Gordon up over Jimmy Johnson, but it's tough. And then for my pioneer, I don't know, like I love Junior Johnson for the sport because he did so much as a driver, and then he was obviously a car owner. So I probably have to go with Junior Johnson, but there's just so many guys from back in that era. Even getting back into the 50s, like Herb Thomas and Tim Flock and all those guys, the pioneers of the sport, and Red Byron. It's so, it's so tough to select one guy, like Fireball Roberts. You could just go on and on and on and on and on, and it would never end. And David Pearson's, probably kind of that same deal. He competed with Petty, and Cale Yarborough's kind of in the Petty area. So if you got to pick one, but to me, I probably have to go with Junior Johnson, but I'd say Herb Thomas and Tim Flock are right up there too. So I'm being all wishy-washy here. I didn't think about this hard enough this week. I didn't do my homework. It's
either way, you're gonna get lit up in the comments, so it's fine.
No, it's tough. I guess you got to go with Junior Johnson just because of his impact for the sport, just in general. You know, he's a crew guy, he's a car owner, and let me ask you, you watch a little bit of NASCAR. What number has won more races, the most races in NASCAR? I bet you get it wrong.
Oh, I don't even know. I don't even know.
Everyone thinks it'd be 43, but
Yeah.
43 is the second one. It's not. It's 11. And
Wow.
most of that is all those years with Junior Johnson because he had the 3 championships with Yarborough, and then he had the 3 championships with Waltrip, and then, the 11's had success. The 11 was Ned Jarrett's number. The 11 is Denny Hamlin's number. Denny Hamlin's won 50 races with the 11 now. So, the 11's had a lot of good chauffeurs over the years, but Junior Johnson as a whole, probably not. You have to, as a driver, I wouldn't put him up there, but as a whole in the sport, I definitely put him on that Mount Rushmore for sure.
Yeah, NASCAR, like unlike other sports, it's hard to come up with 4 just because.
Yeah. Well, you want everyone. It's like basketball too. Even like everyone wants to bunch it all up into one era, and like Bill Russell. I'm going way off the rails here, but Bill Russell won 11 championships. Michael Jordan won 6. Now Michael Jordan's the greatest ever. I agree, but it's interesting, because you go with like Jordan and then LeBron, and then everyone picks their little favorites, and it's like, well, there was a bunch of guys in the '60s that tore it up pretty good too, and that's why, like, when I look back, like Herb Thomas was a 3-time champion. I think he's probably, on the merits of drivers in those early years, I think he's probably the guy I would think of most from kind of that '50s era, or even like a Joe Weatherly, but Tim Flock, those guys. But I don't know. It's tough. Petty dominated his era. Earnhardt dominated his era. I'd say Gordon dominates his era. When you try to get outside of that early era, there wasn't really one guy I would say that stood out. I think maybe that's where the first Hall of Fame class was Junior Johnson, and obviously because of his crew chief and everything else and car owner years, but there wasn't one real standout guy probably from those early years, but, um, yeah, I like to give respect to those early years too whenever I'm doing this. Probably more just because I think about that basketball debate all the time, and it's like, well, what about Jerry West and all these other guys back then?
No, I'm the exact same way because I always make the argument, well, if you gave that player access to the same technology that he has now, what would he have done? And that's why I don't like the eras thing where people are like, well, so and so, he wouldn't be good in this era. I'm like, well, yeah, Kareem and Bill probably never went into a weight room. So you think like if you put them in this era, they're never going to get into a weight room or like their diet's not going to be different? Of course, like if they had access to the same technology, the same training regimen, and oh, by the way, they got to play basketball full time. They didn't have to have other jobs like some of those old guys did. They
Isn't
would
it
probably compete.
isn't it amazing what analytics has really done to every sport
Oh,
when you really
it's
think
made
about it?
baseball unwatchable.
All
It
of it. Like, I mean, racing, like you watch like an old race, and it's weird watching I'll circle back to Mark Martin. It's weird watching a short track race, and like Mark Martin gets to Rusty Wallace's back bumper with like 2 to go in the race to win like a Bristol or something, and he gets there and like he's working the outside, and like I'm thinking in my head, like, oh man, he's burning his tires up. Like, just shove it on the bottom, shove it on the body. What are you doing? Like, and it's like, oh my God, I hate myself. Like, I'm like these, like, and he'd run second. He'd try the outside a few times, and it was never gonna work. But that's the respect that they had. And just now you watch it's like everyone's trained with these analytics because it's like, okay, you get to the guy, you keep the preferred groove, you shove the nose, you drive to the bumper, and you go by him. And that if he's good enough, he'll bump you back out of the way. And that's just how you do it. Now but it all comes down to analytics, like restarts, like we're timing restarts, like everything, every little thing about it. Like, like our ARCA pit crew. Our ARCA pit crew is made up of, my guys from Buffalo, they're, my Uncle Jake, Ricky, everyone, like, a couple of these guys, they're in their 60s. And like, we are like trained and regimented by Andy Seiss, our team manager, to be like better and fast and like good on these pit stops that are just basically kind of cold stops. All we got to do is beat the pace car up. But like there is a plan and a process to it. And I watched the other day, I was trying to fall asleep. I watched, it was like kind of like a backstory about the 1992 Hooters 500, the day where Alan Kwiecki won his champion. It was called The Day. It's on YouTube. It's amazing. You'll cry. You'll be inspired. You'd be ready to run through a brick wall when you're done. Another one of those things I try to turn on when I fall asleep and I just get all into it. But, you know, you watch, Tony Gibson comes out on pit road and he's all nervous because he's the fuel guy. He stumbles a little bit. He tries to get the fuel in and he's nervous because this is for the championship. He's got to get enough fuel in. And Alan takes off in 3.4 seconds. And you could watch the whole pit stop and you see he didn't have the fuel in that good. And then you watch Bill Elliott's guys come in and Junior Johnson's guys, and they were the same time pit stop. It was like 3.4 seconds, but it was like plug, hold, out. You could tell he got twice the amount of fuel in that thing. And, I think about that, because nowadays, we are like tightly regimented on an ARCA pit stop that all we had to do is beat the pace car. And 30 years ago, for a Winston Cup championship on the last pit stop, these guys it wasn't drilled 100%. Like this should be the most professional. And Tony Gibson's amazing. I'm not picking on anybody, but it's interesting to see guys, that, not saying they weren't ready or whatever, but just like not sloppy. I don't really know what the word is. I could never pick on Alan Kwiecki's race team, right? Because it's the coolest story in racing. But just in general, just sort of not like a machine-driven type of plan and process that's in place that you see today. And it's, it was only 30 years ago. You watch, races from before that, and guys that come on pit road, like in the 90s, like Cup pit stops, and the range of pit stops is like 10 seconds sometimes. Like 90s pit stops. So like, nowadays it's like, a second or two, because these guys are just, analytics. Like if we get off pit road at this speed, at this time, we do this, we do that. Everything has a plan now where, 10 seconds, 2 seconds is unimaginable, because if you don't do that, you're not doing it right. But that's just the way it's changed. It's changed everything. It's changed every sport. It's changed defense versus offense on football. It's changed every restart in NASCAR. And it's interesting to think about, and I think about this stuff because actually Denny Hamlin picked on Dale Earnhardt, said he wouldn't be good at this form of super speedway racing nowadays. I'm just like, kind of calm down, Denny Hamlin. But, it's interesting to think about, like, because you watch like Dale Earnhardt and Mark Martin and these guys, and they were just like raw racers. Like the kind of probably racer I model myself after is just like this pure racer. Just go out there and just be a race car driver. You watch those guys, they were just race car drivers. Where now, to win a cup race, like you gotta have everything plotted. Like this guy goes here, you go here, you're spoiler dragging him on this restart, you're bumping him, you're shifting at this point. Like everything is mapped out, where it's not just, okay, Dale Earnhardt, go be Dale Earnhardt. Like Denny Hamlin's an amazing race car driver, but Denny Hamlin has a process that he has a team manager, he has a crew chief, he has a spotter that they're going in simulators and they're practicing this crap all week. And it's analytics. It's all things that they are just trained in every situation. They have a plan versus, okay, in every situation, just go be Dale Earnhardt. Like Dale Earnhardt, you just be Dale Earnhardt and we'll ride with that. Versus like, okay, like now it's every situation has, if this happens, you do this. If this happens, you do that. It's studying and everything. It's just, it's interesting to think about though. Like I believe that, Dale Earnhardt would have been successful in a thing like that, but it would have been different because you're not just relying on those God-given instincts anymore. You're relying on your spotter's instincts more than you were back then. You're relying on your team's plan more than you were back then. So it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, we went from the only two things that mattered were lap time and pit to now there's like 17. Like, you just watch the broadcast and they're like this, and I'm like, I don't. First of all, I don't understand what one guy is faster. I don't know. And they're like, well, they're like breaking down, and this turn he was this much, and I'm like, I don't know that this has made this more watchable, but there's a lot of numbers to talk about now, and I don't know if it's made the sport better. I have no clue.
I think it's just a product of, you know, the nature of how things are thought about today, especially in competition, and it's made the sport astronomically more expensive because it doesn't stop with it's planning on the car. There's engineers for every little section of the car. Every little nut and bolt has a filter, something. I mean, there's a thought to everything, and the stuff that they do for a little bit of an aerodynamic advantage and the stuff these crew chiefs and engineers come up with it's unbelievable, really, when you really get down to it, and in 1983, Cale Yarborough flipped his car in qualifying at Daytona, and they went up and they got a show car. It wasn't even the right body style. It was a Pontiac or something, and they brought it down and they put an engine in it, and he went on, won the Daytona 500. Like, you couldn't do that now. Everything's got to be placed and plotted and scanned, and the engineers got to check everything off, and it's probably for the worse, I think, probably more than anything that's going on in race car, because it's almost out of the crew chief and the driver's capacity to really dial in a race car to be the fastest race car on the track anymore, because you can't beat a computer, and an engineer is essentially, a computer being translated into your race car, and the syn time and everything else that goes into it. Like Harry Hyde going to the racetrack, and the car's pushing, so he changes the sway bar and does this or a little bit of that. Like, there's another guy that's run 200 simulations in his simulator is just as good as your one practice that you just did, and he's already 200 steps ahead of you. You're never going to catch up. So it's kind of out of the hands of the driver and the crew chief, and more in the hands of the engineers. And I think what it does is it creates a lot of parity, for one, for sure, because it's hard to get a leg up on anybody. But it takes away some of the pureness of the sport too, because it's not built in the same way. It's not the same guys overcoming, being a little bit better, being a little bit smarter. It's computers and analytics and engineering.